Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thanks so much for joining us this afternoon. My name is Serena Longo, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore and the Edmond and Lily Safra Center for Ethics, I'm very pleased to introduce this virtual event with Daniel Gross, presenting his new book, A Banker's Journey. Thanks so much for joining us virtually today. This event is the latest installment in the Ethics in Your World series, presented with Harvard University's Edmond and Lily Safra Center for Ethics, which features leading thinkers taking on tough problems that matter to us all. Learn more about the Edmond and Lily Safra Center for Ethics at ethics.harvard.edu. And to learn more about our many other upcoming events, you can visit us at harvard.com/events and sign up for our email newsletter. Today's discussion will conclude with some time for your questions. If you have a question for our speaker at any time during the talk, click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and we'll get through as many as time allows. In the chat, I will shortly be posting a link to purchase A Banker's Journey on harvard.com. Your purchases and financial contributions make events like today's possible and help ensure the future of a landmark independent bookstore. Thank you to our partners at the Safra Center, and thank you all for showing up and tuning in support of authors, publishers, and of course, indie bookselling. Now it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker. Daniel Gross is one of the most widely read writers on finance, economics, and business history. He has worked as a reporter at the New Republic and Bloomberg News, wrote the Economic View column in the New York Times, and served as Slate's Money Box columnist. At Newsweek, where he was a columnist and correspondent, he authored 7 cover stories. A frequent guest on television and radio, he has contributed to more than 60 publications and is the best-selling author of 8 books. Today, Daniel has joined us to present his newest book, A Banker's Journey, How Edmond J. Safra Built a Global Financial Empire. The Wall Street Journal calls it graceful and factual and a joy to read. And Michael Bloomberg writes, A Banker's Journey captures the fullness of a man whose mind for business and appetite for adventure was matched only by his heart for giving and sense of responsibility to others. His impact continues to be felt, and now the inspiring lessons from his life will reach an even wider audience. We're very pleased to host this event today. Daniel, the digital podium is yours.
Thanks so much. Thank you, Serena. Thank you, everybody, for coming. It's great to be at a virtual event with the Harvard Bookstore. I was a graduate student at Harvard studying history in the early 90s and whiled away many hours when I should have been studying or working at the Harvard Bookstore. And I'm glad to be here to talk about my new book, which is the story of a banker's life, Edmond Safra. And embedded in there, coursing throughout it, is a tale not just of a person and a man who made a fortune, but who had a particular ethic when it came to banking and finance, and in particular to philanthropy, and his sense of what the businessman's responsibility was to society and to members of the community, and how that community is defined is something that is one of the animating spirits of this book. You know, when I wrote the first chapter, and Serena, can I have the first image, please? That's not me, that's Edmond Safra as a young man. When I wrote the first chapter and showed it to my wife, she said, yeah, we'll stick with this one. She said, you know, you were born to write this. And in a way I was. You know, I spent a lot of my time studying business and economics history, and as an undergrad and graduate student, I've spent 30 years chronicling the developments of global finance. I've written 8 books, been a columnist for the New York Times, went to Davos for many years. I've interviewed pretty much every major figure in finance, from Warren Buffett to Alan Greenspan. And that's a qualification that would let me construct the story of someone who had this remarkable banking career in the second half of the 20th century. Edmond Safra started 4 banks on 3 continents and worked in literally dozens of countries. He was an avatar of financial globalization. And a banker is what he was. But to tell the fullness of his story, you had to have another attribute. Next slide, please. A banker was what Edmond Safra was. Who he was something else entirely. He was a Syrian Jew, even though he was born in Beirut, lived in Brazil, and had homes in 6 or 7 different countries. And this is part of what enabled me to tell the story. My last name is Gross, which is a Jewish Ashkenazi name. My father is from the Bronx, and his family came from Russia. But he was an only child, and his parents had died before I was born, so we really didn't know any of his family. And the family that I had was my mother's family, and her name was Sandra Nasser. My grandfather was named Leon Nasser. He had 8 or 9 brothers and sisters. My grandmother was named Frida Dweck. These were my great-grandparents came from Aleppo and Damascus. So we weren't the traditional Jewish experience of America. We were not Goldbergs and Schwartzes. We didn't talk or curse or have terms of endearment in Yiddish. For us, it was Arabic. We didn't have matzo ball soup and brisket. We had hummus and kibbeh as children. And our descendants saw themselves as subjects of the Ottoman Empire, not the Tsar. The Syrian Jewish community is a remarkable one. There's no Jews left in Syria, at least 20 years. A large number came to the US in the 1920s, and they all pretty much live in the same neighborhood in Brooklyn, the same town in New Jersey, the same town in Florida, 40, 50,000 strong. People think they're insular, but they're really quite cohesive. And part of my family came from Aleppo, and that's the core of the Syrian Jewish historical community, which has an iconic and totemic status. In the Bible, there's reference to a city called Aram Sova, that is Aleppo. The great synagogue there had a cornerstone that dated to the 3rd century, so one of the longest Jewish continuous existences anywhere in the diaspora. And one of the oldest existing Torahs is called the Aleppo Codex. It was a 9th century Torah scroll that existed in that synagogue. So if you were someone who was born to write the story of Edmond Safra, you would have to occupy that overlap in this Venn diagram between people who are capable of writing sweeping narratives about 20th century global finance and people whose great-grandparents also came from Aleppo. And next slide, please. The overlap is a very small one, and it contains a rather old publicity picture of yours truly. Next slide, please. So Edmond Safra was a very private man. He was born in 1932 into a banking family, the son of Jacob and Esther Safra. At the age of 15, he was sent by his father to Milan and started trading gold. In his early 20s, he moved his family, including his younger brothers, to Brazil and instantly set up a series of trading operations. In the late 1950s, he started a bank in Geneva called Trade Development Bank. In 1964, he came to the United States and had a startup bank called Republic Bank, which he started with $10 million. It grew to be the 11th largest bank in the United States. The stocks of his banks had a compounded 25% annual return over decades. He became a billionaire. He lived in some of the best real estate in the world. But along the way, he was single-handedly the protector and often the savior of the Jewish communities of Beirut and Aleppo, offering people jobs, moral support, financial support, using his connections, building synagogues wherever they were forming communities. I say that for the Syrian Jewish community and the Beirut Jewish community, he was a Rothschild, a Buffett, and a Schindler, all rolled into one. A great many dramatic things happened in his life. There was a crazy episode in 1988 where American Express ran a smear campaign against him. That 1 year in his life was documented in a 500-page book. There are lots of conspiracy theories, a lot of misinformation that flourished in his lifetime because of who he was and where he came from. But what I learned is that there is his foundation has a personal and corporate archive that has documents in 8 or 9 different languages: Hebrew, Arabic, Portuguese, Italian, Spanish, German, French. These are all languages he spoke. In addition, in the years after his death in 1999, they had conducted interviews with hundreds of people who knew him at every stage of his life, from second grade in Beirut to titans of finance like Henry Kravis. Now, I know Hebrew, I can read Arabic, I can muddle through these other languages. And when I got this archive, when someone showed it to me, it was like dumping out a box of a 2,000-piece jigsaw puzzle. You could put it together if you could understand how they interconnected. There's a lot of, I wouldn't say code, but you have to understand the slang, the languages, how business history and financial history interconnected with what he and his community were going through. The document I have on the screen now is a promissory note that was written to his father's bank in Beirut in 1927. You can see in the middle, it's written in French, but also in Arabic, and there's the signature of Jacob Safra. Again, to a lot of people, this information would be meaningless or simply flat, but there's a lot embedded in there. And if you didn't have that sort of background, if you didn't know Arabic, if you didn't understand why gold traded freely in India and Hong Kong in the 1940s, but not in Europe, if you didn't understand what it meant when you called someone a hamor in Arabic, which means a jackass, then you couldn't tell the totality of the story. My own grandparents were very proud of their heritage and of the Syrian community and passed that pride on to us. I knew my great-grandmother, who herself was born in Aleppo around the same time that Edmond Safra's father, Jacob, was. And so when I read these interviews and when I read these letters, I could hear their voices in that accent. And as I said, Edmond Safra was a very private man. It was almost impossible to find video of him or tapes of him talking. He really never appeared on television, but the story was there if you could get the access to the material and if you could understand it. So when a colleague called me in 2017 and asked if I knew who Edmond Safra was, I said yes, or at least I thought I did. And very quickly I was meeting with his wife, Lily Safra. Next image, please. Who was a vital person in this story. Lily Safra died this summer at the age of 87. She was a formidable woman in her own right. When she met Edmond in the late 1960s, she was already wealthier than he was. She had an eye for collecting fine art, real estate, and really opened up his world from circulating mostly in the financial realm to arts, culture, and politics. In his own life, Edmond never named anything after himself. That was simply something that was not done in his community. You named something after your father, your mother, your siblings who had passed. But in the 20 years after his death, Lily Safra continued Edmond's legacy on a global basis, supporting Sephardic synagogues, schools, sites like the tombs of Rabbi Irma Balhanes in Israel, and institutions like Harvard University Medical Research. She died earlier this year, but when we met, she had told me that somebody had tried to put together this story from the documents, but they were business writers and were really only able to tell the institutional history. They were not able to understand why, when the family shipped its possessions on a ship from Milan to Brazil, they included 2 kilograms of a spice called za'atar, which is a basic for Lebanese cooking. They didn't understand why his license plates and phone numbers inevitably ended in 555, because in Arabic, the sign 5, the Hamsa, it's a very common symbol, is a sign of good luck and superstition. They didn't understand why he did deals on a Tuesday, because in the Bible, in Genesis, there's a line where God says that Tuesday is a good day. They talk about it twice. And they don't understand why, even as he built a multi-billion-dollar banking empire, he consisted on continuing to own his father's tiny bank in Beirut, Banque de Crédit National, even after the last Jews had left Beirut, and he owned it at his death. Next slide, please. And they certainly didn't understand why, when he had a groundbreaking for his corporate headquarters, a 30-story tower in the middle of Fifth Avenue, there were not 1, but 2 rabbis. But I felt that I understood this because I knew this world and I knew the community that he came from, and I was able to understand his motivation. So it was the ability to understand these motivations and details that led me to put together this story. Edmond Safra was born into some very powerful, the first several chapters of the book are essentially the names of either cities or countries that document how he came to set up his global empire. Next image, please. The story starts in Aleppo. Aleppo was the 3rd largest city in the Ottoman Empire, a historic node in the trade routes to Asia. And it was here in the 1860s, 1870s that the Safra Frere, the Safra brothers, first appear. There were 4 of them, and together they formed a firm that did money changing, finance, gold. They lived in the Ottoman Empire, and it was something of an integrated whole. So one went to Constantinople, one went to Alexandria, one stayed in Aleppo, and one went to Beirut, and they all worked together. For the Aleppo Jewish community, which I said was a historic and very old one, they were among, I wouldn't say the aristocrats, but they were well known as one of the chief banking families. And the type of banking you did there was intensely personal. You only lent money to people you knew. Paying it back was a matter of your family pride and family honor. And their relationship to the community. In Aleppo and later in Beirut, there were these formal community institutions, councils with elected presidents that had organized different groups to deal with hunger, with poverty, with burial. And the Safras were always very involved in those. World War I ended the Ottoman Empire. It came apart, and as we know, the Middle East was sort of carved up between a French mandate and a British mandate. And that really ended the justification or even the logic of having a firm where you would have people in Egypt and Turkey and Syria, because the Ottoman Empire existed no more. And so the Safra brothers entity disbanded, and Jacob Safra moved to Beirut in 1920. Can I have the next, please? Jacob Safra, the man in the middle, was Edmond Safra's father. He was born in the early 1890s. He moves to Beirut, sets up a bank there called Bank Jacob Safra. He and his wife Esther had many children. Edmond is in the far left as you're looking at this, next to his mother. Beirut in the 20s, 30s, 40s was a remarkable and unique place, cosmopolitan, francophone, a banking center for the Middle East. It was a, next slide, please. A place where there was a sort of sectarian entente where Muslims, Christians, different varieties of Muslims, Druze, Jews coexisted, shared power. This is a photo from the 50s. In the middle is the Benzion Lichtman, who is the chief rabbi of Beirut. To his left, on his left hand, is Jacob Safra wearing a tarbouche. To his right, in the lighter suit, is Pierre Gemayel, who is a leading Christian figure. And then further on the right, Muslim and Jewish religious figures. It was a sort of place where on Passover every year, there would be a huge kind of reception in the Jewish quarter, Wadi Abu Jamil, where sort of the grandees from all the communities would come, pay respect, and pay honor. This was the world into which Edmond Safra was born. Next, please. Oops. Edmond Safra was born in 1932, and he was born into a series of networks. Everyone will tell you in business school that networks are what matter. LinkedIn, financial networks, people you know. Nobody had better networks than Edmond Safra or knew how to use them better. He was born, I said, into the network of Aleppo Jews. Aleppo in Arabic was Halab, and if you were from Aleppo, you were a Halabi. And even after you left 2, 3, 4 generations, that was your identification. There was a highly successful merchant and trading class, and the diaspora was already forming. So in the 1920s and the 1930s, there were already, there would be 10 Jews from Aleppo in Manila in the Philippines, in Tokyo, in Hong Kong, in Manchester, England, where they were involved in the textile trade, in Milan, in Argentina, in Brazil, in the US. And you were instantly, because people had large families and they all got married, everyone kind of knew each other. So that was one network. A second network was the network of the Alliance. The Alliance was a network of French-speaking Jewish schools that had been set up by French philanthropists in the 1870s because Jewish kids in the Middle East were not getting great educations. And this was a network that stretched from Morocco in the West to Iran, through Bulgaria and Greece. They would bring promising people to train in France, in Paris at a central training organization, and send them out to teach school. And it was like a very large kind of fraternity. You were part of that network. And he was already part of the network of Jewish bankers. I mean, this was a world, again, 19th century, early 20th century, where people tended to do business with the kind of people they knew. I found documents here that they were trading gold already in the 1920s and 30s with the Mokadas in London and with the Rothschilds. I recently interviewed Jacob Rothschild, who is 86, and he presided over this 1972 public offering of Edmond Safra's bank. You could see N.M. Rothschild as the lead underwriter. And he stood at a press conference and said, you know, we've known you, our fathers knew your fathers, our grandfathers knew your grandfathers. Even though they came from extremely different worlds, there was already this sort of financial network that he was able to plug into. Can I have the next slide, please? Edmond was a pretty indifferent student, but his father viewed him as a prodigy, as a banker. This is a photo of him when he is 16 or 17. He always looked much older than his years. And at the age of 15, his father sent him to Milan. This was 1947. There were convulsions starting to happen in the Middle East, although Lebanon was the only Arab country in which the Jewish population actually increased after the founding of the State of Israel, in part because so many Jews from Syria moved there. But his father, Jacob, was thinking, we need to have a beachhead for our family business outside. And he sent Edmond at the age of 15 with a 19-year-old chaperone to Milan. His mandate was to do business. Again, there were a dozen or so Aleppo Jews who lived there. So he had people he can know. He had a bank account set up. They knew people. And he basically went around Europe buying gold. At the time, the gold market was essentially closed. In other words, it didn't freely trade in the US or Europe. The price was fixed at the Bretton Woods agreement. There was no sort of reason or logic to buy or trade gold. The Safras knew how to move gold from Beirut to Kuwait to India to the Far East, where it did trade freely. So Edmond went around to Switzerland, to the Netherlands, to Paris, and bought gold, sent it back to Beirut, and from there onto the Far East. He got his older brother-in-law, who had been a surgeon in Aleppo and had to flee. He sent him to Hong Kong and said, you stay there, we'll send you the gold, you can sell it into the local market. And he was involved with, instantly, again, as a teenager, was functioning in a world of men, much older men, and able to do so on an equal footing, even though he was much younger. Next slide, please. One of the things he was doing, again, at the age of 19, 20, 21, was financing films in Europe. This is some documents relating to the film of a movie called La Fille de Regiment, a kind of translation of an opera into film. And when Errol Flynn was trying to make a comeback and make a extravagant version of William Tell, Edmond Safra was among the people who backed him, early in his 20s. Now, Europe might have seemed like a sort of good home with proximity to the Middle East. He knew the languages, but ultimately in 1954, he left and he took the family to Brazil. Next slide, please. In 1952, the Safra family's apartment had been ransacked in Beirut, and they decided, it's time for us to leave. But nobody would really, even though they were quite wealthy, the world was really not open to the Safras. The US had a clampdown on immigration. You couldn't simply move to England or Italy or France or become a citizen, but Brazil was open, and there were a few Syrian Jews who were there already. So he decided, at the age of 22, hey, we're moving the family to Brazil. My younger sisters are coming. I put one of my brothers in boarding school in England. I'm taking my father, and we're going to move to Brazil. This, of course, is one of his passport from the 60s. Because he wasn't a citizen at the time he moved there, he was unable to found a bank. But what he did really within a matter of 2 or 3 years was set up literally a dozen trading organizations. So he was bringing in industrial equipment from behind the Iron Curtain and bartering it for coffee from Brazil. He had a factory that made jute bags, the kind of bags that coffee goes into. And all the while, he was constantly traveling back to Beirut, to Geneva, where he had another home base, and kind of circulating throughout the world, building these businesses in Brazil. Next, please. So Geneva became his base in Europe. And you can't imagine a place more different than Beirut or Sao Paulo than Geneva. But there in the late 1950s, he set up Trade Development Bank, which became a classic Swiss bank, a safe haven for deposits for people who were often fleeing the Middle East. He loved to recruit his former neighbors and friends from Beirut as clients. And his vision of there, of course, was to make money, but primarily to protect people's assets. Because these were people, what they called the suitcase generation. They always had to have a suitcase packed in case they needed to flee. His next stop, 5 years later, was New York. If any of you know New York City quite well, this is the Knox building. It's adjacent to Bryant Park on the corner of 40th and 5th Street. And the story goes that he was walking by there and decided to buy the building. He bought it for about $3 million in 1963. It's probably worth 100 times that now. Some people decide to live above the shop. he decided he would live in the residence on the top floor, and that the base of it and the rest of the offices would be where he would have his new bank, Republic Bank of New York. Next slide, please. This was to be a very different type of bank than his banks in Lebanon or Switzerland. New York, this was the world of the sort of striving middle class, a consumer economy, an economy that was open to everybody. And he always was surprised by the possibilities of America. This is a photo from the opening of Republic Bank in 1965. And of course, Robert F. Kennedy, who was the senator for New York, showed up to inaugurate the bank of a man who was not even an American citizen. And he thought that was kind of amazing. Now, what Republic did, it wasn't into private banking. It was into kind of banks for middle-class people in Brooklyn, Queens, New York. They would open accounts. He got rolling, and for a few years did okay. And here he showed a kind of genius for American-style marketing. Can I have the next slide, please? When you meet people today of a certain age, they will tell you Republic was the television bank. And because at the time you couldn't really compete for deposits by saying, you know, I'm going to pay 6% interest when everybody pays 3%, there were regulations. You couldn't give people big premiums. There was a limit of $10. So that's why people opened a bank and got a toaster. But there was no limit to what I could give you if you brought your friend in to buy a CD. So they decided they would offer people black and white televisions if they brought in friends, colleagues, neighbors who would buy a CD for $5,000 or $10,000 and keep it with the bank for a year. And the reason he wanted those deposits is because instead of lending it out against mortgages or cars in the US, he knew he could place these overseas to get higher returns. So they started this campaign. Black and white TV at the time cost a few $100s, which is a lot of money. And instantly there were lines out the door. There was a woman named Ida Schwartz who apparently referred 25 of her friends and neighbors and ended up with 25 televisions. Can I have the next, please? I apologize for the poor pixelation here. He was always looking for bigger stages, right? So he was a man who was born into a family business, but was not at all satisfied with the size of it, always looking for the biggest stage. And at one point in the 60s, he told his nephew, who was saying, you know, should I come to stay in Brazil? Should I go to New York? He said, well, you can stay here in Brazil, or you could come here and meet David Rockefeller. And that's David Rockefeller, though his name tag is obscure. To me, this really kind of indicates how he was able to live in several worlds at once, in his personal life and in his banking life. And this international existence he had informed the way he built a business and approached banking. He loved to do loans that were guaranteed by the Export-Import Bank or the World Bank or the IMF because he knew those would get paid back. They were guaranteed, even if they had lower interest rates. His bank specialized in banking-like services that trace their origins to Aleppo. They were always active in the gold market. Edmond Safra didn't like to spend money because he believed that the banker himself, the individual, was responsible for the deposits. There was no banking insurance in Brazil or Beirut or even Switzerland at the time. And he didn't believe that the FDIC would ever bail out this foreign guy if push came to shove. He always said that he would lose all his money before anybody else lost any money. And he personally owned 30% of the stock of his banks, which were public. You borrowed on your name, you took people's assets and deposits on your name, and that's what he stood behind. So while he had this global network, he also had this very personal sense of what the banker's job was. And I can't tell you the number of people who have come up to me at events I've done over the last month who say they knew him personally. They had a small account, but he came to look them in the eyes because they were asking for a loan. In today's world, that is not a functional way of doing business, but he somehow managed to do it. Can I have the next, please? This is a picture of Edmond Safra in a synagogue with two of his brothers. And, you know, I write in the book that people like Edmond Safra and the Syrian Jews generally, they acculturated without assimilating, and that he clung very tightly both to the rituals of Judaism and the sense of community and responsibility that it engendered. And there was no contradiction between him conducting banking on a global scale and rubbing shoulders with David Rockefeller, and then also being in synagogue on every Saturday. In the world he came from, there was no contradiction. And his view of how you did banking, how you treated customers, and what you did with your profits was directly informed by his Judaism and his sense of responsibility and a community leader. The Safra'S were leaders of the community in Aleppo, in Beirut, and then especially in the diaspora when everybody started to fled. The first recorded donation I have from him was at the age of 16. He was in Paris. He needed some papers. The people at the Alliance training school helped him, and he said, what do you need? What can I do for you? And they said, we need some refrigeration equipment. And so he said, okay, I'll give it to you. I'll buy it for you. And they didn't believe him. He was just a 16-year-old kid. So they called Beirut and said, is this guy to be taken seriously? Can we take him seriously? And of course, the answer was yes. Can I have the next, please? This is a letter from him between Isaac Shalom, who was a leader of the Syrian Jewish community in Brooklyn, and it's about giving $5,000 to a shrine in Israel that honors an ancient scholar. And ironically, or perhaps strangely, in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, despite his intense connection with Judaism, Edmond Safra did not publicly associate with the state of Israel. The reason was twofold. One, he did a lot of business in Kuwait and Saudi Arabia. He had his bank in Beirut, and there were blacklists in those days that people associated with Israel, people wouldn't do business with them. And the second was that there was a core but dwindling population of Jews in Beirut and also in Aleppo and Damascus, who eventually were essentially held hostage there. And he felt that if he was too publicly involved, that bad things would happen in Beirut and Aleppo to the Jews. So he didn't make his first visit to Israel until 1981, but behind the scenes, he was communicating with leaders in the diaspora to support the creation of synagogues, community centers around the world. He had a particular affection in these years, 60s, 70s, for helping Syrian Jews create synagogues in communities wherever they were forming, whether that was in South America or New York. Next, please. Here he is, with the honor of signing, helping to write a Torah with his wife behind him. Next, please. And this is a letter from the Lubavitcher Rebbe, Rabbi Schneerson, written to him in 1971. And you can see that the Rebbe was very meticulous and kind of made marginal notes and corrections. And the occasion of this was that Edmond Safra had given 2 Torahs to a synagogue in Brooklyn, which was one of the main synagogues. But he sought these honors mostly in the name of his parents, and he did many of these things anonymously. I found receipts in his papers. There was a small synagogue in the island of Rhodes whose Jewish community had been decimated in the Holocaust. Literally 90% of them wiped out. Edmond had been there one summer, and every year he would send a $500 check so they could have a cantor come and do high holiday services. His philanthropy wasn't just about giving money. In many instances, it was a direct intervention in people's lives. To be a Jew in the 20th century, whether you were in Europe or the Middle East, was to know displacement. And for these people, I said he was like a Rothschild, a Buffett, a Schindler. Can I have the next, please? This is a letter in French, 1978, from Le Rabbin de Aleppo, the rabbis of Aleppo. There were still 7 or 8 or 9, 10 rabbis hanging on there. And what this letter says is that the chief rabbi, a man named Yom Tov Yedid, was suffering. He had lost some money. He was really in bad shape, asking for help. And at the top, in the handwriting of his personal assistant, you could see $7,500. That was how much he had given. His masterstroke in helping the Syrian Jewish community came in 1994. There were 4,000 Jews left in Damascus and Aleppo, essentially held hostage by Assad. There's a brief kind of moment of opening after the Kuwait war. And Assad said, okay, I'll let them go, but they all have to buy round-trip plane tickets. I don't want people in Syria to have the impression that you can just leave and not come back. And the organization called Edmond Safra, and he, on the spot, bought 4,000 plane tickets for the last remaining Jews to leave Syria. Okay, the next, please. But his support for Sephardic and Syrian communities went beyond simply providing money and salvation. There was I think one of the unfortunate factors of Jewish life in the US and also in Israel is a kind of level of prejudice and ignorance encountered by Sephardic Jews who came from Yemen, from Morocco, from Iraq. In Israel, in many instances, they're treated as second-class citizens. And he was not just the champion of Lebanese and Syrian Jews, but also of Sephardic Jews at large. This is an image of Edmond at the 18th anniversary of a foundation called ISEF, the Israeli Sephardic Education Foundation. In the 70s, a colleague had come to him and said, you know, in Israel, only about 2% of Sephardic kids, these are, again, people who had come from Iran, Yemen, Morocco, go to college. And he, of course, thought this was ridiculous. He was a man who spoke 7 languages, who could function at the highest levels of society. Jews from Beirut and Aleppo were doctors and lawyers and business owners, and it didn't make any sense to him. So he decided to start this foundation that would send Sephardic youths to college and postgraduate education. Closer to home, here in Cambridge, in the 1970s, when he became becoming a larger figure in the US, colleagues and friends started saying, you know, you should donate some money to Harvard. And he had given some money to a singing group at Radcliffe, but that really didn't, excite him that much. In 1978, he endowed the first chair in Sephardic Jewish history at an American university, and that was the Jacob Safra Chair at Harvard. And that really started the whole discipline. Kind of the next, please. As I said, this was a man who was comfortable in the boardroom and the synagogue, and his life revolved around several poles. First Beirut, and then Milan, then Sao Paulo, Geneva, and New York, later London, Paris, the south of France, and Monaco. He didn't, because he was in constant motion, he didn't really settle down and have his own family. He got married in his 40s. To Lily Safra, who had her own children, so he didn't have his own biological children, but he really viewed himself as a community builder. And there was a element of contradiction. Can I have the next slide, please? He was at the center. This is now a photo of the Knox building, the building I showed you before, that he bought in the 60s. And then his bank later acquired the property around it and built this 30-story glass headquarters that today is the HSBC headquarters. So he was right in the middle in the establishment, rubbing shoulders with David Rockefeller. He knew everybody. Next slide, please. He was a figure in the sort of international social world. This is a photo of Edmond and Lily Safra at their villa in the south of France, which is called La Leopolda. It had originally been built by King Leopold of Belgium, and when it debuted, and they did a lot of renovations. And in 1988, they had 2 separate parties for 400 people. The first was for business associates, people from the worlds of art, entertainment, and politics. And the second was basically all his sort of Syrian and Lebanese friends. This was a moment that should have been a period of triumph and kind of comfort for him. But it actually marked what was the beginning of a sort of nadir and a low point in his life, because right after this, in 1988, was one of the most mystifying episodes in American business history. In the summer of 1988, let me briefly dial back. In 1982, he had sold his Swiss bank to American Express. American Express, blue chip financial supermarket. He agreed, of course, to stay on and work for them, but it was never going to work. He was treated like an aristocrat, like a king at his own banks. And here at American Express, suddenly he was running a unit. And by the way, he also still had Republic Bank, which he was also chairman of. In 1983, he says, this isn't going to work. I'm going to leave. So he leaves American Express, and he has a 5-year non-compete. And it's very clear he's going to go start in 1988 his own new private bank in Switzerland that would compete with the bank that American Express had bought. American Express tried to stop him in the courts in Switzerland, failed. In the summer of 1988, articles start to appear in newspapers in Peru, in small newspapers in France, saying Edmond Safra is a drug dealer, that he's involved with the Medellin cartel. And he starts suing in France for libel because this is not true. And hiring private investigators to understand why this is happening. And during the discovery process of one of the cases, the defense lawyers turned over some documents to Edmond. They're like, yeah, this is where this writer got the information from. And there was a fax sign at the top called a telltale that said it had been faxed from an American Express office. This story is documented in a book by Brian Burrow, one of the authors of Barbarians at the Gate. The book is called Vendetta. It's a book about 1 year in Edmond Safra's life. It's 500 pages, and it details in cinematic detail this sort of smear campaign against him and how it was rolled back. And it was really, eventually they confronted American Express with the evidence that they were behind it. American Express issued an apology, and rather than sue, Edmond said, you should just give $8 million to the Red Crescent, to a hospital in Switzerland, to a Jewish charity, and we'll move on from this. Can I have the next, please? Edmond Safra's right, so after the American Express affair, he goes back to building his banks, but he suffers a series of setbacks in his 90s. And I think this book, at the end of the day, this is a tale of business success. And we see many other stories of business success. He ultimately sold the banks for $10 billion in 1999, a record price paid in cash for an American bank at the age of 67. And again, in a classic American business success story, this would be the ending. Business chronicles tend to be either, hey, smashing success, Ray Kroc and McDonald's, Bill Gates and Microsoft, or the sort of WeWork, like someone had a success and then crashed and burned. This is definitely a story, I think, of business success. However, at the end, there is a strong element of tragedy. And there were kind of 3 or 4 tragedies that struck his life in the 90s. The first was the attacks from American Express. And for somebody who viewed his name as everything, it was very damaging. The second, in the early 1990s, he was struck with Parkinson's disease while still in his early 60s. And it's a progressive degenerative disease, so that by the late 90s, he really couldn't fully manage the global empire he had built. A third tragedy related to his family. In Edmond Safra's world, every business was a family business. Banking was an intergenerational trust. It's why he managed the banks the way he did. In 1997, Republic Bank sold 100-year bonds, meaning they were contemplating being around for 100 years. But Edmond had married late. His wife already had her own children, so he had no biological children to be in the business. His banks were publicly held. And his 2 younger brothers, who he had set up in business in Brazil, had meanwhile built their own institution called Banco Safra. And they were unable to come to an agreement about who might succeed him, how that would work, how this collection of businesses could relate to each other. They just couldn't figure out a succession plan. So in the summer of 1999, he decides to sell the banks. And in May, the deal was struck. And there are a few things that are noteworthy about this. First, he decided he wanted to sell for all cash. He didn't want to be a stockholder in somebody else's company. Second, the price was $72 a share. Some people might recognize 72 is 4 times 18. 18 in Hebrew is high. Again, it might have been a matter of circumstance that it came out to that, but he was someone who insisted on having the sort of numbers of the business he did, like identify with his culture, with his heritage. When he sold his first bank, he wanted $555 million because that was an auspicious number. He had settled for $520. So he sells the bank for $72 a share. And also telling was his reaction. After he sold the bank, a friend came from Geneva and said, Mabruk, which means, congratulations in Arabic. What an achievement. Look what you've done. And he looked at her with sadness and said in French, j'ai vendu mes enfants. I've sold my children. I've sold my babies. And that's how he viewed his banks. But he was indefatigable. Even though he was sick and 67, he set out to start another financial institution. He had an arrangement with HSBC that he could take his own money, which was about $3 billion, and get other clients up to about $5 billion and start a new asset management company. And this one, he was finally going to name after himself, which is going to be called the Edmond Safra Company. He was filing the papers to do that in December 1999, when he died in a fire that had been set by one of the nurses who worked for him. And this very quickly, sort of in short order, his business career ends, his financial career ends, and his life ends. And he left most of his assets to his foundation, whose work has been carried on for the last 23 years, first by his wife and now by the trustees. Next, please. So that, in a nutshell, is the journey of this particular banker. And I think in summing up, what I want people to take away from it is not simply a great story with fantastic details about what life was like in Beirut in the 40s, the intimate correspondence he had with financial figures like Jacob Rothschild or the Warburgs, or the charitable organizations, or the kind of triumph of the Syrian Jewish community in reconstituting itself in the new world, but rather that a ethic or a sense of how you conduct yourself in business affairs, how a bank conducts itself, and what the purpose of finance is. Of course, his purpose was to make money. He lived really well. He lived rather large. He liked the finer things in life. But for him, a lot of what he saw his purpose was, and people spend a lot of money coming up with corporate purposes and what our mission is. His purpose was providing dignity. And for him, dignity was having access to your assets in case you had to flee. It was having bodily security, that people wouldn't come and try to harm you. And it was having a place where you could pray and meet with other members of your community wherever you were. And so that is the kind of ultimate message I would hope people take away from the book, and that I will leave you with today. And I thank you all for coming and for your attention, and happy to discuss if there are any questions.
Thanks so much. That was really interesting, especially not really knowing anything about this sort of larger than life character. It was really fascinating. We do have a few questions. Let's see here. All right, so we have one here. Thanks so much for this great talk. How do you think Edmond J. Safra was so capable of adapting to so many different cultural, not to mention financial settings?
That's so. I'm in London, and I did an event here yesterday where I was in conversation with Jacob Rothschild, who is now 86, and of course, I posed that question to him, and he gave an answer to me that was not totally satisfying, because he said, Edmond he grew up, he was cosmopolitan and rootless, R-O-O-T-L-E-S-S, which of course, plays into a lot of sort of stereotypes that people say about Jewish financial figures, and that because he wasn't from any one place, he was someone who knew from a young age how to do business in many different places. And I think it's exactly the opposite. He was rootful. He had this very strong identity with Aleppo and with Beirut. He refused to give up his Lebanese citizenship. He had it at his death, despite everything that had happened in Lebanon. He refused to sell that bank. So he knew where he came from. And where he came from, the responsibilities and the modes of doing business were something he picked. He would go to his office in the bazaar with his father when he was 9 or 10 years old. So a lot of this he inherited. A lot of it was the milieu he was operating in. But of course, plenty of other people had similar experiences and weren't able to do this. I think at some level, he was a savant. He was a savant with languages. He was a savant with numbers. And I think he also had the emotional intelligence beyond to sort of walk in somewhere, size people up, figure out how to talk to them. It came instinctively to him. And I think in business, we talk a lot about genius, people who are great at coding or coming up with a business idea. And I think his genius had to do with, his facility for languages, but which is really a kind of metaphor for a facility of dealing with different contexts simultaneously. And all of this without the aid of a computer or the computer screens that we had. It was all sort of in his mind.
Thanks a lot. Here is another one. Did you come across any stories from his life that you didn't have room for in the book and you'd like to share with us now?
I would say about 80% of the stories I came across. As I said, I had a thumb drive that had the archive, and this is like, again, going back to the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s. And then the transcripts of these hundreds of interviews that really, documents in an archive are flat. They're 1 or 2 dimensional at best. And having these interviews where people were like talking about these events and talking about their personal relationships were, helped me to create a sort of 3-dimensional picture. Just one small thing, and I was always kind of constantly amazed at his attention to detail, even as he was running, it's one thing to run one bank, it's another to run 4. So there's one where he's writing to someone in Beirut and said, I heard from someone, they came in, they tried to open an account, they spoke English, and the person there didn't really speak English. It's really important that we have people, who are multilingual, and there's someone there who's able to speak English at all times. And this was, again, the bank in Beirut was this tiny little enterprise, and here he is writing. Another was in the 70s, again, at the time, sitting atop 2 or 3 different banks that he owned, and he's writing these letters to a guy, a supplier of like the card holders, that you go to a bank, and on the teller's table, there's like a card where they put the cards, and he's writing the sort of specifications. I want them in this color, and I want this many pens, blue, red, and green, and these ashtrays. I want the ashtrays to have like a gold rim on them. And again, I'm like, why is this guy is hanging out with David Rockefeller? He is running 3 institutions. He's buying fine art. He's doing all the things sort of like magnates do. And here he is like incredibly deep in the weeds with attention to detail. And I think a lot of the other ones, his banks were very profitable, in part because they almost never had a credit loss, but they were not run to be the like efficient machines today. He saw them in part as employment agencies. The people coming out of Beirut, they were fleeing to Brazil, to Argentina, to New York. They didn't know the language. They weren't banked. He found places for them. He's in Beirut when he had sort of favorable treatment because his family was a big family. He was a terrible student. His teacher, Madame Torahs, said, if you're going to end up being a nobody. They said to his brother Joseph, if you don't study, you're going to end up shining shoes like your brother. That's what's going to happen to you. 15 years later, he's in Geneva. This one, Madame Torahs comes in to like check on an account or to see him, and he comes in and says, "Are you ready for your shoe shine now?" So he had a sense of humor about, he knew he wasn't a great student, but certainly didn't hold that against his teachers. And another one of his teachers who had like helped him pass the math exam, Professor Robert, again, 15 years later, needs to get out of Beirut, says, okay, come to Argentina, I'll get you a job. And literally dozens of examples like that in the book. And as I said, I did an event about 3 weeks ago in Brooklyn in the Syrian Jewish community there. And literally dozens of people whose names I had not come across, came up to me afterwards and said, I was in school with him, I moved to New York, and this is where I worked.
That's amazing. Yeah. It's a question that we see a lot of, and authors always have stories that they wish they could have made room for, and they just can't. So thank you for that. Let's see. We have one here. Safra's wife seems like an interesting character. Do you think she was unique among bankers' wives at the time?
Very much so. So Lily Safra was born in, I believe, Uruguay, grew up in Brazil. She married at the age of 18 or 19, had a child, divorced, married a man named Freddie Monteverde, who was a business owner, owned a kind of chain of appliance stores in Brazil. He died by suicide in the late 60s. So at the age, in her 30s, she was essentially a single mother of a few kids, a widow. And when she met Edmond, she was actually probably worth more than him at the time. So she was someone who had assets. And again, she spoke 5 or 6 languages. She had, it's interesting, when you look, Edmond Safra liked collecting watches and French furniture. He admired the craftsmanship, but those were not things that really appreciated in value. He wasn't that interested in paintings. She was extremely interested in paintings, and their collection is just sort of off the chart that they started building in the 70s and 80s. That was her eye and her influence. Her influence as well on the type of philanthropy he did, sort of expanding out from Jewish causes to universities and healthcare. The foundation itself, again, he set it up in '97, has a charter for education, medical research, particularly Parkinson's, and Jewish organizations.
Great. I think we have a time for a couple more. This is just a quick one, but someone is wondering if the book is available in audiobook.
It will. It's being recorded as we speak. The rights were sold, and I think the guy's in the studio right now, and should be out in December.
Great. Thank you. And here's a good one to end on, I think. Whoops, excuse me. His career ended in 1999, which is a really long time ago in financial history. So are there lessons from his career and life that we can apply today?
Yeah, I think, it is interesting. I told the publisher when this book came out, I said, I think we're going to get a lot of coverage in the Jewish press around the world, and probably not quite as much in the business press. And the reason is, the financial world moves very quickly. It processes stories. Since 1999, we've had the dot-com boom and the great financial crisis and inflation and whatever it is we're living through now. And a million, we were crypto, like that's what people want to talk. And so when you talk about 1999, it may as well be last century. In fact, it was last century. Not only that, he had a kind of self-consciously, to a degree, old world view of banking, even though he was global and used technology to the greatest effect. And again, some of his sort of colleagues said that he had a 19th century mind in the 20th century. So at first blush, you would say, it's hard to see in the way that finance works today, what the lessons are. But to me, in 2008, when the financial crisis happened, and you remember all the banks went bust, but everybody still got their bonuses and their stock and got bailed out. A business journalist wrote an article that said, where are you, Edmond Safra? In other words, if people had the attitudes that he had about their personal responsibility, we would not have been in the situation with the banks. And I think that notion that when you manage someone's money, or when someone entrusts their money to you, whether you are a financial manager, an investment banker, a broker, or even just run a company with stockholders, that's a trust. It's something, the typical CEO has a tenure of 5 or 6 years, and they act accordingly. But if you think your tenure is your lifetime and potentially your brother's lifetime and your children's lifetime, you're going to operate a lot differently. And I think what he showed in his lifetime is that you can operate that type of enterprise in that type of way and still be extraordinarily profitable. And I think that's a lesson. If more people had that sort of long-term view, then that filters down in not only to the types of decisions you make, but in the way you treat your employees and the way you look at the world.
That sounds about right to me. And yeah, we're right on the dot of 1 o'clock. Thank you so much for this. This was really great. And thanks to all of you for your great questions. Anything you'd like to leave us with?
No, it's, buy the book and buy it from the Harvard bookstore.
Indeed, yes. And
thank you for hosting, and thanks to everybody for coming.
My pleasure. And yes, thank you all for spending your afternoon with us. I dropped the link in the chat to find the book on harvard.com. I'm just pasting it in there one more time. And yeah, on behalf of Harvard Bookstore and the Edmond and Lily Safra Center for Ethics, all here in Cambridge, Massachusetts, enjoy the rest of your day. Keep reading and be well. Thanks so much.
Bye.